All right, kind enough to give us some time here, Libertarian Presidential candidate Chase Oliver. Chase, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Chase, we were talking off air that, we had met a while back at the free and equal elections debate that happened back in February. You did a great job at the one that just happened this past July in Las Vegas. We're going to get into a little bit of that in just a second because there was a candidate that gave a speech before the debate but didn't join the debate. I want to get into that in just a bit. But first, for our audience that maybe is not familiar with you, obviously Nick and I are familiar with you. They may not know anything about how you ran in Georgia for senator. Tell us a little bit more about Chase Oliver's journey so far in American politics and why you are running for president.
Yeah, so really my beginning in politics starts with being an activist. I started out being an anti-war activist right out of high school because I opposed the Bush wars. But from there, I, was nominally a Democrat until 2008 when we elected Barack Obama. And then he kind of walked back all the anti-war promises he made. So even though he won the Nobel Peace Prize, I felt compelled to leave the Democratic Party. I discovered the Libertarian Party for the first time in 2010 when I was at the Atlanta Pride Festival. The Libertarian Party of Georgia was there, campaigning with their candidate for governor and others. And that was my first Libertarian vote. And then as an independent over the next few years, I still voted Libertarian until 2014 when I became one full-fledged party member. And then I've gotten to run a few times. I ran in 2020 for U.S. House in the 5th District in Atlanta because John Lewis had passed away and there was a special election to replace him. And then in 2022, I ran for the U.S. Senate in Georgia as the Libertarian candidate, running against Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. I initiated the runoff in that race by earning 2.1% of the vote. And now I am the Libertarian candidate for President of the United States after having campaigned across all 50 states, campaigning to as many people as possible. And I think it was that energy and drive that ultimately won me the nomination after 7 rounds of voting well into the night and into the next morning. It was 1 a.m. on Monday during the weekend of our convention when I won the nomination.
Chase, on this platform, if you don't mind just taking us through, because obviously we all know the news from Sunday, new Democratic nominee. That process is about to hit a reset button. We obviously know who the Republicans are running with, and their respective platforms are pretty, readily available now. But for libertarians, just nationally, where do you all stand on the major issues? What essentially would make up the libertarian platform?
Well, I think if you look at our platform and our principles, much of it is rooted in the idea of non-aggression and the fact that we think that the government should not be doing anything that's beyond protecting the liberties and the civil liberties of one another. And so much of what government does we find to be either redundant or unneeded or expensive. And better suited in the private marketplace. And so with the largest issue this is the day, I would say the largest issue being inflation. We want to get spending under control. And certainly we believe that the trillions of dollars in debt we run up each year is the primary driver of inflation. And so we believe that we should at least balance the budget and continue to cut spending until we can continue to cut taxes and get government down to as small as a government as possible. So really, when you look at to what is the libertarian solution, usually it says, can the free market do this better than government? Is this an essential function of government? And if both of those questions, if the answer to the first question is yes, and the second question is no, we believe the government shouldn't be doing it.
Chase, you fed into the follow-up perfectly because, Nick was mentioning about the libertarian platform. I want to get into some of the issues specifically because, we've done some voter focus groups here, and obviously you've been traveling the country, like you mentioned, trying to garner support and gain people's votes. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of the same things about where do you stand on your economic policy? The price of consumer goods are higher year over year. Where do you stand on immigration? And what is the true crisis at the border? So we're going to get into a bunch of it in a second, but I did want to play for you first a clip from the debate that happened a couple of weeks ago at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas, because you said something that I thought was really interesting on the stage when you were asked by Representative Thomas Massey, who co-moderated the debate with Christina Tobin, who's the founder of Free and Equal Elections Foundation. You got asked a question about economic policy, and you kind of tied it into Social Security. So take a listen to this.
Get government out of the way of innovation. That's what will boost our economy. Reduce the debt, reduce the deficits, and you have to do that by cutting spending. You can't just cut taxes, because when you cut taxes, you create debts and deficits which drive up inflation and is a hidden tax on every single American. So not only do we have to cut taxes, which I would love, but we have to cut spending, and you do that by being brave enough to grab the third rail of American politics, Social Security and entitlements. We have to get these under control or remove them entirely. Why? Because my generation right now, I'm paying every paycheck I get into a Social Security program that will be completely bankrupt by the time I'm retired and need to retire. It's a better idea to sundown that program to allow individuals to save for themselves and actually have a real retirement.
All right. So, Chase, first, I want you to explain a little bit more in depth, because obviously in a debate answer, you're only getting 2 minutes to respond. And then either Jill Stein or Randall was answering back afterwards, or they pivoted to another question. But after you explain a little bit more of that in depth, one of the things that, you hear from older voters, and I can just tell you hearing from my dad, is don't come from my Social Security. And here's Chase Oliver saying, no, we've got to sundown these programs. So can you explain a little bit more of what you were trying to explain in that answer about touching the third rail of American politics? Why is it the third rail of American politics in your estimation?
Well, for the very reason you just described, that people feel like they can't talk about it or mess with it at all for fear of losing votes. And of course, my Social Security plan actually leaves Social Security in place for those who are already retired or near retirement, because they've paid into that system their entire lives. They've been expecting it. But younger workers like myself, who are around the age of 40, we know that even if we're paying into this system, it's insolvent, or it's not going to exist by the time we retire. And so we're going to be looking for better options. And I think the better option is to allow the employee contribution to come back to us as workers, and so we can invest that into our own savings for retirement. And you leave the employer contribution going into paying into the system long enough to keep it solvent for that last generation to retire. And this is being realistic. This is recognizing both that we don't want to take Social Security away from those who live on a fixed income, like my parents, like millions of people's parents and grandparents, but also that we want to be able to save for ourselves and have more economic security outside of a broken Social Security system that is insolvent. But I do think it's the third rail, because so many people are afraid to take it head on. Even talking about things like raising the retirement age has people up in arms and, with their pitchforks and torches. But for younger folks like myself, we're just recognizing the economic reality of we're not going to have it. So why are we paying into it?
Chase, in the past, and I talked about obviously Sunday's, massive change with Biden's announcement. And about a week before that, we saw an assassination attempt of the former president. It brings back the conversation of guns, which has been part of the public discourse for many years now, especially since the mass shooting at Columbine in 1999. Where do libertarians fall in this conversation? Because there's obviously the space of the role of government in terms of having some kind of potential more sound gun policy. And then obviously staunch Second Amendment activists who want no restriction at all. Where do you live with that?
Yeah, we're far more on the latter side of that conversation. We do believe shall not be infringed. And as the Libertarian Party, we do support your right to defend yourself. We do support the right of gun ownership. And we do believe that if the government can own a gun, you can own a gun. So we've been very much on the side of supporting and defending the Second Amendment. I think the bigger conversation we need to have around mass violence, certainly since 1999, is what has caused the change in our society that has had mass shootings being more prevalent, even as crime rates have gone down, and violent crime rates at that. I think the two big factors that we see, one is the rise of social media, where people can hide behind a screen and a keyboard and dehumanize others, say sorts of things that you would never say in actual conversation with people for fear of, honestly, getting a knuckle sandwich, right? Like if you said some of the things people say online, you would be removed from a conversation politely. At best. Now, I think the other thing we have to look at is the rise in use of drugs to treat mental health issues that could be better, handled, not using psychotropic drugs, but talk therapy, using tools like psilocybin therapy, MDMA therapy, ketamine therapies that are far better at treating trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, some of these contributing factors that so many of our shooters in these situations have. I think those are the two conversations that really can better move us in a direction, as opposed to who can, and banning guns, creating registries, these sorts of things that might deny people their Second Amendment rights. because we've always had guns. You know, my mom loves to tell me that she had a rifling team at her high school. So kids came to school with bagged rifles that they threw in their locker and they went and shot after school. And yet there was never a school shooting, even though there were a dozen rifles available at the school at any one time. That just tells me that it's a change in culture, not a change in the fact that guns have been prevalent, because they always have been.
No, Chase, I appreciate that answer. One of the things I've appreciated about you is just hearing you not only at these debates, seeing you obviously in the Senate runoff, where I first got introduced to you, obviously besides meeting you, but it's the way you're answering some of these questions about policy, vision, and strategy. I think anybody who truly lives in a center lane where they think that there's a third option out there, if they listen to you, I think you'd be getting a lot more notice. So in that vein, I want to stay a little bit more on drilling into something policy wise, because, and I'm sure you've maybe heard this, you could tell us if you have or haven't on the campaign trail, has been about immigration. And if you can't notice by Nick and I's face, we're sons of immigrants, right? So this is very important to us. But the thing that I've been very vocal about as I've been making media rounds and things like that, and on this show specifically, is the crisis at the border is a largely administrative one. If you go to the DMV and 1,000 people are waiting online, but there's only 3 people working there, there's going to be a backlog. And that's what we're seeing with the immigration courts. That's what we're seeing with these asylum trials. And not only that, the agency in charge of all of this is telling you they need help. They're underwater, they're undermanned, and they're under-resourced. And I know the Libertarian platform is we've got to remove a little bit more of the governmental control on all of this. So where do you stand issues-wise, specifically around immigration? No administration has been able to solve it in 30-something years. How do we solve, can we solve the issue of immigration at the U.S. southern border?
Yeah, I think we can. I think it first starts with acknowledging exactly what you just said, that it's not a crisis created by immigrants wanting to come here and work and live. It's a crisis created by our government's inability to properly process these people and create legal status for people who want to come here and work and contribute to the economy. I call for a 21st century Ellis Island. You mentioned that you and Nick are both children of, or that you're children of immigrants. That's where 4 in 10 people can identify their heritage through Ellis Island, the last great wave of migration that we had in this country that built up businesses, that built up culture, that built up neighborhoods, that built up communities all over this country and helped make part of the patchwork quilt that is America. And I want to continue that tradition by streamlining the immigration process. I think if you want to come here and work, you should be able to come through a port of entry, declare who you are, do a quick background check that can vet for you, do a health check that can make sure you're all good to go, and then come into the United States and work and contribute. That doesn't automatically give you citizenship, obviously, though we should streamline that process, frankly, as well, and certainly give legal status to dreamers, people who were brought here as children through no fault of their own, through their parents bringing them. They need to have legal status, obviously. But if we can streamline this process, we do several things. One, we remove the backlog at our southern border that has so many people staying at the southern border as they wait for their asylum claim or other things. We can just remove that backlog immediately. Secondly, we remove immigrants from the shadow economy, so their labor is no longer being exploited and wages being driven down, not just for them, but also American workers who are competing with them. You're actually competing in a free and open market where people have legal status and they're not having to settle for less because of fear of deportation or being reported. You also make communities safer, because in an immigrant community right now, if you fear deportation, you're not likely to go report the crime that you just saw to the police, because you don't want your name to be put on the police report. You don't want to have to be asked those questions about where you came from or why you have an accent. And so many people in immigrant communities just don't report these things, and that actually makes our neighborhoods less safe. And so actually streamlining the process, creating a legal status for people who want to come here and work and contribute will make our community safer. It's better for immigrants. It's better for the American worker. Oh, and by the way, it allows us to laser focus our law enforcement at the border on those who are seeking to human traffic for the purposes of labor or sexual exploitation, or those who want to fraud people by putting fentanyl and pressing them into, say, a Xanax tablet and falsely selling that on the black market and poisoning people and causing overdoses. These are the crimes that you actually want to prosecute at our southern border, not peaceful people just wanting to come here to work, but crimes of fraud, crimes of trafficking, crimes of coercion. These are the things that really need to be addressed, and they can be better properly addressed when we laser focus ourselves and allow peaceful people to just do what they're going to do, which is contribute to their American dream.
Chase, you were talking earlier about cutting government spending. One thing that Republicans talk about is education spending, particularly in the form of the Department of Education. And we've looked at platforms such as Project 2025, and more Republicans talk about the need to reduce that education spending at the federal level. Consequently, obviously, at the state level, there are sometimes gaps of what you're trying to provide students in the form of Title I, Title II based services, obviously Pell Grants and other opportunities for higher education. Where do you all stand on the government's role, or at least from a financial standpoint, in the education of kids?
Oh yeah, well, from the federal level, we do want to eliminate the Department of Education. We do want to eliminate the federal spending on education, return that money back to the states, and ultimately, I'm a supporter of the free market of education. So what I would like to see is in states adopting if we're going to have taxation funding this stuff, fund the student, not the system. Fund the individual student, allocate that money to a student to go to whatever school they want to go to, whether that's whether that is a religious, parochial, private, charter. You can continue to go to the public school you're continuing to go to, or even being homeschooled. This allows for more freedom in education, and this allows for educational entrepreneurs to find spaces that do need the gaps to be filled in, where there's real crises going on. If you go to a great public school and you're funding the student, not the system, that school is going to likely keep being funded because they already have the building, the infrastructure, the school bus routes, everything that's already needed. But if you're in a community with a failing public school, like Atlanta, where I live, where the Atlanta public schools are so bad that the teachers and administrators got busted on RICO charges for colluding to cheat on test scores to get more funding. Well, you might want more opportunities in your area and in your community. And in those spaces, new schools will pop up. And this also actually is not just better for, I think, parents and students to be able to decide the best school that tailor fits to them, their needs, their individual strengths and skills, particularly when it comes to like high school age students, maybe going to an engineering school or a technical school or a performing arts school or whatever school that might be tailored fit to them. But also is great for teachers who, so many of them come into the industry wanting to be a great teacher that helps to create critical thinkers, lifelong learners. And then they get into a public school system and they see how busted the curriculum is and they get frustrated. And this is why we have so many teachers who leave the industry, because they just feel like the school system itself is not helping them achieve what they want to help achieve for their students. And so I'm a full educational free marketer because I see the potential there, particularly in communities of great need that have really bad schools.
Chase, at the beginning of this, we kind of started talking a little bit about the wars that are happening in Israel and Ukraine when you were kind of briefly touching on foreign policy. So I would love for you to dive into this, specifically if you're commander in chief, of the U.S. military right now. Obviously, we're not involved militarily with ground troops in either of these conflicts, but we're involved in terms of how much aid we're giving to Ukraine and to Israel. But then we're also involved in giving aid to the places that are being blown up, right? Where people, innocent civilians, are dying. So both conflicts, if you can, give us a little bit more of what Chase Oliver's platform and policies would be about handling foreign conflicts like this.
Well, as I said, I got my start being an anti-war activist, and I continue to want to end the militarism of the United States and our military footprint overseas. If I could, I want to start the process of removing ourselves from every foreign military base and returning the United States military back to its actual mission, which is to protect us from sovereign invasion, not to be the world's police, which we can do with a massively reduced Pentagon budget and still be more readily available and able to protect ourselves than any other nation on earth. And so with regards to both of these theaters of war, I would like to end the aid process. I think with regards to Ukraine, if Europe wants to take the lead helping to arm Ukraine, I think they should do that as we pull ourselves out of being in charge of the European theater. I do believe that the EU should be really in charge of Europe, not the United States guiding their policy. And so I think the best thing we can do in Ukraine is both allow refugees to leave Ukraine who are being bombed right now, who want to leave the theater of war and come settle somewhere peacefully until the war is over. We should allow for those refugees to come here, as well as allow for amnesty for any person who's being conscripted in the military. I say that mostly because much of Russia's military right now who's invading Ukraine are conscripts, many of whom who don't want to be there. And so if we can allow them to go AWOL and arrive at amnesty, we're going to demoralize the front lines of the Russian military and hopefully have them pushing back and suing for peace more quickly without firing a single shot. With regards to Israel and Gaza, October 7th was horrible, and I think what we saw, and if we saw it in our own neighborhoods, we'd be demanding some sort of response. But I think it's the nature of Israel's response, which has killed tens of thousands of innocent Gazans, completely destroyed the infrastructure of Gaza, to where it's going to take billions of dollars of reconstruction to even come to some sort of semblance of a normal life there, as if they weren't already in desperate need before October 7th, as if there wasn't already great misery in that area of the world. And so what I would like to see is a ceasefire. I would like to see the release of the hostages, obviously. But I think what we need to see is both the Israelis and the Palestinians demanding better from their governments and demanding that both sides come to peace. They are both being horribly represented in Gaza by Hamas and in Israel by the Netanyahu government, which continue to push for more strife, more division, more war. And I think the worst of that is that you're seeing civilians being harmed by that process. And we need to be a voice for peace. And we need to disengage militarily from both of these conflicts, as well as just generally disengaging from the Middle East and our drone policy and much of what we do around the world.
You know, Chase, and you've been gracious to grace us here with your time. I truly appreciate it, and you explaining not only the Libertarian platform, but where you stand on some of these issues. I did want to ask you before we let you go, is something as I was watching the Libertarian convention this past year that happened in Washington, D.C., the elephant in the room, right? The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, made an appearance and spoke at this convention. And obviously, you can go into a little bit of detail of what you make of him coming to the convention and kind of seeking the votes of libertarians, you know, to maybe get him over the finish line come November. But I'm interested just for your perspective, you know, and I've been very vocal about this, as has Nick. You know, before we started the primary process back in January, 64% of Americans said they didn't want to see a rematch between these two folks. And obviously, there's always been, you have a great video that's on your website about the third party candidate and the rise of a third party candidate. And when can somebody actually break through? You probably get asked this all the time. And I want to put it in realistic terms, because if there were ever a time in American politics where we've seen this kind of supported by data, where it is showing now that people are looking for a third candidate, a viable option. They're punting, they're pushing, you know, matriculating it till November to make that final decision. You've heard these terms like, I'm just going to hold my nose and vote for, and that's not the way American politics should be when you're voting for the president of the United States. So a two-parter here. First, the former president of the Libertarian Convention, what'd you make of all that? Is he just placating, or was he trying to actually make some good points? I think you're going to lean to the former. And then the second part was really more about, how do you guys actually break through on this national stage? Obviously, access and obviously media availability and things like that. But how does a true third party candidate rise through and finally make a dent in American politics?
Yeah. So your first question, Donald Trump coming to our convention, you know, I think he probably gave the shortest speech he's ever given at a rally. It was the most uncomfortable audience he's ever been in front of since running for president. Because he came in thinking he was going to have a very friendly audience because he was invited. But what he got was an audience who was ready for him to answer to a lot of the unlibertarian things he did while he was president. He gave a speech. There were a couple moments where we did applaud. That was when he promised to free Ross Ulbricht if he was elected. You know, I think as much as I don't want Donald Trump elected, if he were and actually did that, that would be one good thing he's ever done, so to speak. But really, it was him trying to come in the room and explain why we don't need a third party, why we should just settle for the lesser of two evils. And we've been told that for 50 years. It's not really broken through to libertarians. I don't know why he thought it was going to break through this time. But yeah, so he was most welcome to come and be loudly booed for his policies because he basically just gave the normal Donald Trump speech. Now, as far as you know, as far as how do we grow the Libertarian Party, I think it starts with continuing to run energetic campaigns across the country to win things like ballot access and major party status through our elections. There are several states that are dependent upon my ticket for earning ballot access in future elections in states, or earning major party status that gives us access to things like the primary ballot, debate inclusion, increased media attention. All of these things are the building blocks to help build your party up foundationally. And I think the most important thing is that we fight to change the way we vote. Ranked choice voting or approval voting or any advanced voting model beyond plurality voting will allow for voters to pick their favorite choice without worrying about it, quote unquote, spoiling and allowing for another candidate to win. And so I think if we can change the way we vote, much like Maine and Alaska have adopted ranked choice voting, I think if we can adopt that in more states, you're going to finally see more representative elections and more civil elections. But absent that, I encourage people to continue to vote outside of the two-party system and make their voice be heard. And even if we don't have ranked choice voting, continue to try to build up your local Libertarian Party, try to vote in nonpartisan elections, vote Libertarians into office, so we can actually have proof of concept what happens in local communities when we elect limited government advocates and liberty advocates at the local level. So I'm looking forward to doing that work as a presidential candidate as much as possible.
All politics are local, they say. You can find out more information about Chase and his campaign at votechaseoliver.com. Go check out the free and equal elections debate that happened at Freedom Fest this past July 12th that Chase was a part of. Chase, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program. Continued success to you, sir, and please stay safe.
Hey, you guys have a wonderful day.